Hello, everyone, and we're back again with the next chapter. Well, most of the chapter I'm about to read concerns itself with scenes of domestic bliss. The one that resonated most with me is when Jilly goes to the still room to leaf through Cousin Galis's books. For all book lovers out there, especially those who belong to a whole family that loves books, the library at home can be a wondrous place. It takes on the character and mixed personalities of everyone who has added to it. For someone coming to it after a long time, each and every book rekindles the stories associated with it. Who bought it? When? Are there any stories surrounding its acquisition? Our home library, which to me has grown to be quite considerable, has a very mixed character. Books added by my mother, which form the bulk, they range from like all possible classics to some, noir potboilers, to some non-fiction travel accounts, to books on physics, to gorgeous, thick cookbooks with pictures that make you add on the pounds just by looking at them. They make you immediately hungry. And then some of my grandmother's collection, parts of them can be seen peeking through as well. Her old children's poetry books in musty hardbacks, but still with the bright colors, yellow and red and green. Collections of our bard, as we call him, his songs. Children's versions of our extensive epics. These all form part of the books coming from my grandmom's collection. And then come my father's books. Now, those are on homeopathy, just like Cousin Galis. Huge hardbacks, each weighing about as much as a brick. Beautiful books on painting and etching and art. And of course, some on car maintenance. So this was the library that I grew up with. And then, of course, you grow up with one, you get into the habit. And I created my own as I traveled around the globe. And my books traveled with me from one place to the other. Don't ask me about the shipping costs that I've paid trying to get these across with me. Well, soon both these collections will meet each other, and hopefully a new dimension will be added to our family library. With that, let's dive into, as we said, Jilly's picture of domestic bliss.
Chapter 18, Thornyhold by Mary Stewart. I made myself some lunch, fed Hodge and the dog, and spent some time with the latter. He was more relaxed now, seemed pleased to see me, and managed to wag fully half his tail as he ate a mixture of brown bread and chicken scraps softened with chicken stock. When I let him out for a few minutes, he showed no desire to run away, but did his business and then retreated into the safety of the shed. I locked the door on him again and went back into the house. I'd promised to look for the special recipe book, and if I could find it and hand it over to Agnes, It might keep the traps away, at least until I could get the dog temporarily out of the way. I suspected that what Agnes really wanted was not a recipe for something like bramble jelly. What could be special about that? But the secrets of some of Cousin Gaelus's cures. As far as I was concerned, she could have them. One thing I was certain about, they would do no harm to anyone. I had locked the inventory along with a copy of my cousin's will in the desk in the den. I got it out, took it into the drawing room, and sat down to read it through. It was arranged room by room. I started by skimming quickly through the contents of the room I was in: furniture, soft goods, pictures, ornaments. As far as I could see, without detailed checking, everything was there. Last came the contents of the big bookcase. This, if I was to be accurate, would require a detailed check, but for the moment a rapid glance down the list must suffice. When I had cleaned the room, I had spent a long time over the shelves and could more or less remember what was there. It was a rich collection. Novels, one or two biographies, like me, she had little taste for them, a full collection of travel books, that is, travellers' accounts of exotic countries, books about animals, 3 full shelves on birds, another on butterflies and moths, and 2 on trees, flowers, and grasses. But the main and most attractive section was on gardens and garden plants. I glanced at some of the latter. The book on plants were a gardener's selection, not a herbalist's. There was nothing here that would be called a recipe book. In any case, Agnes Trapp had access to these shelves, as to the cookery books in the kitchen and the few reference books in the den, so the still room was really the one likely place. I leafed through the inventory and found it. Still room contents. A series of formidable lists, page after page of chemicals or distillations, all those bottles and jars named and in order. A mercifully short list of furnishings, followed then, finally, 3 full pages of books. But no trouble there, no trouble at all. The first title was underlined in red, the only one to be so distinguished, and its title made it sure. Goody Goslow's Own Home Remedies and Receipts. Goody Goslow, the old lady who had lived here for 70 years, whose reputation as a witch had passed right on to Cousin Gaelus, and now after a fashion to me. Goody Goslow, expert on magic, who had made Thornyhold into an enchanted stronghold to keep out evil and allow the good to grow and ripen, whose home remedies for healing had presumably been studied and followed by my cousin, whose recipes Agnes Trapp was so very anxious to see. I checked that the doors were locked, then took a duster and went upstairs. At first glance I could see nothing that might be Goody Goslow's book, but there were dozens of volumes, some of them much used, some even ragged with handling, and it would be easy to miss a small book tucked inside another. I set to work methodically to lift the books out in sections, examine them one by one, dust them, and return them to the shelves. It was heavy work, and it was slow, not only because I cleaned each book before returning it to its shelf, but because the books were fascinating, and I lingered over many of them. Of its kind, it seemed to be a comprehensive and probably a valuable collection. I was no judge of its completeness, but there seemed to be everything from a kind of primer of homeopathy to a tome, heavy with thick paper, woodcuts, and small print, which seemed, it was in German Gothic, to be a treatise on botany. I found translations of Dioscorides and Galen, reprints of the herbals of Culpeper and Gerard and John Parkinson, at least half a dozen books on the planning and planting of herb gardens, and several on wild plants and their uses, side by side with exotics like Maori medicines and A Witch Doctor Remembers. And that was the crop. There were recipes in plenty, ranging from simple things like mint and comfrey tea to Wrap the kumaras in puriri leaves and bake slowly over hot stones, then dry in the sun for 2 weeks. But no sign at all of Goody Gosler. The only real find of the afternoon was on the top shelf, where I lifted out 3 volumes of somebody's treatise on the edible and poisonous fungi of Europe. Behind the books, dusty but still gleaming, was the crystal globe that Cousin Galis and I had looked into on that day by the River Eden. I stopped at 4 o'clock for a cup of tea and a visit to the tool shed, then got back to work. By the time I had finished and the books were all back in place, it was growing dark and my back and arms were aching. I had a bath, then fed the dog, and made supper for Hodge and myself in the kitchen. Afterwards, for the first time, I set a match to the drawing-room fire, and soon had a cheerful, bright blaze, with the light dwelling on the pretty crotons and polished furniture and the glass of the bookcase. As I went to draw the curtains, Hodge, who had followed me into the room, asked to be let out of the French windows. I obliged him, then after a moment's thought followed him out, and went out to the tool shed. This time the dog, I must try to think of him as Rags, met me just inside the door and let me lead him round and back into the house. I sat down in one of the armchairs with a book I had noticed earlier, Pigeons, How to Keep and Care for Them, but kept my eyes on the dog. For a few minutes he wandered uneasily round the room, sniffing, exploring, with frequent glances back at me, and the tail ready to wave whenever he caught my eye. Rags? I tried it, and he came, and was patted and soothed, and finally, with a sigh, he settled himself down beside my chair, nose on paws, blinking at the flames. It was a long, peaceful evening. The dog slept, only rousing when I got up to put a log on the fire. I could not guess whether he was used to a house and a hearthrug, but he certainly took to mine with no hesitation. Finally came the sound I had been waiting for, Hodge's demand to be let in. I glanced at Rags. He raised his head, eyed the window, and wagged his tail, but did not move. I crossed the room and opened the window. In came Hodge, stopped dead, blew himself up to a formidable size, and spat furiously. Rags lay still, wagging that ingratiating tail. The cat advanced. The dog shrank nearer to my chair, abasing himself. Watching the duel of wills, I was satisfied. The dog obviously knew cats and liked them. The cat, the dominant animal, would take time to get used to the dog's presence, but knew himself to be in no danger. A week or two, and all would be well. I sat for a while longer, watchful over my book, while the dog went back to a wakeful doze, and Hodge stalked with great dignity to the armchair on the other side of the fire and settled, with frequent pauses to glare at the dog, to washing himself. A movement on the table at my elbow caught my attention. The globe. I had set it down there and forgotten it, and the firelight was moving over it, light and shadow, colour and darkness. Black spirits and white, red spirits and grey, mingle, 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 you that mingle may. It was bad luck to quote from Macbeth, wasn't it? But then, that particular rhyme was not from Macbeth itself, but only quoted from some older witch play. Hodge the witch's cat, with one leg still held rigidly upright, had stopped his washing and was staring at the globe. His eyes were wide and bright, but his fur lay sleek, newly licked and unruffled. He looked interested, no more. I picked it up, held it between my hands, and stared into it myself. They were still there, among the shadow and the flames, the flight of pigeons. It was like looking into one of those old paperweights which, when shaken, lose a snowstorm. Flock after flock of pigeon wheeled and circled, then, while I watched, coalesced into one shimmering cloud of flight and sank slowly to rest. Rag seemed happy to go back to his bed in the tool shed. I left him there with a biscuit and a bowl of fresh water, then set a saucer of milk in the kitchen for Hodge while I locked up. Hodge, still slightly edgy, but mollified by the dog's banishment and the soothing ritual of bedtime, stalked ahead of me up the stairs and vanished into my bedroom. One part of the evening ritual remained. I filled the water jug for the pigeons and went upstairs to the attic. I believed I had expected it, but all the same, I stood there for several seconds while the superstitious flesh crept up my arm. There were 3 pigeons now, on perches side by side. They shuffled and cooed. Nothing could have looked more innocent than these birds of peace, these messengers of the dead. The new one was different yet again, blue-grey, its breast glimmering with iris. It regarded me placidly with garnet eyes as I reached out and lifted it from its perch. There was a message on its leg. Of course there was. Gently, I removed this, put the bird back, put food down, and poured fresh water into the trough before I unfolded the screw of paper. The birds flew down to the grain, and the newcomer dipped its head to drink. Standing directly under the unshaded electric bulb, I unfolded the thin fragment of paper. It was different writing, a thin printing in capitals. "Welcome to Thornyhold, and God bless your sleep," it said. No signature. I crossed to the window and stood for a long time, looking out at the fading colors of the sky, where, on that extraordinary night, I had seen the owls and the beckoning light, and had flown through and over those high whispering trees. I had always been content to know that there was more in the living world than we would hope to understand. Now I found myself drifting on the peace of belief, even if it meant that that nightmare had been the truth. I thought I would accept it. God bless your sleep. Perhaps if I forgot the other long-past nightmares and recalled the good things of my childhood and what I had been taught, he would. End of chapter 18.